What if the financial disasters we call crises were never accidents at all, but carefully engineered phases in a repeating cycle that has taken down nations, empires, and entire monetary systems for centuries? What if everything we are living right now, record inflation, asset bubbles, soaring debt, collapsing trust in institutions, is not chaos, but stage 5 of a predictable pattern that always ends the same way? If that question makes you uncomfortable, good. Because understanding this cycle is the only way to see the truth behind the narratives we are fed every day. Every major financial breakdown in history follows the same hidden architecture. It starts with manufactured inflation, expands into intoxicating bubbles, snaps violently into crashes, and then mutates into a carefully orchestrated rescue operation that benefits the architects of the system, not the people trapped inside it. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize that the real fraud is not in the scandals we read about in headlines, but in the structure itself. A structure built to transfer wealth upward, conceal risk, and keep the public believing that no one could have seen it coming, even though the pattern is older than modern banking. But here's the question that should stop you cold. If history shows this 6-stage cycle repeating again and again, why are we following the same script today? Why are governments, central banks, and global institutions behaving exactly like the regimes that walked straight into collapse before us? And why is the current system already showing every symptom of being deep into stage 5, the point where the illusion begins to crack and the consequences can no longer be hidden? What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not theory. It is a historical pattern so consistent, so mathematically precise, that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you recognize how far along the cycle we already are, you'll understand why the next few years may define an entire generation. Before we go deeper, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the system was designed to keep ordinary people confused, while a small group always walks away richer? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video if the topic speaks to you, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next parts, because what you'll discover next might surprise you. And as we move forward, keep your mind open, because the next stage of this cycle reveals even more than most people are prepared to face. The first stage of the grand fraud cycle always begins quietly, almost invisibly, with something the public is taught to see as normal, even necessary: inflation. But inflation in this context is not a side effect of economic growth or natural market forces. It is an engineered expansion of the money supply designed to set the entire cycle in motion. When governments and central banks inject new money into the system, they are not simply stimulating demand. They are diluting the purchasing power of every existing dollar, shifting wealth from savers to borrowers, and from the public to the institutions closest to the source of freshly created money. This is the silent extraction mechanism that primes the system for everything that follows. At first, it feels harmless. Prices rise slowly. Asset values climb. Wages adjust just enough to keep people from noticing what is being taken from them. But beneath this calm surface, the monetary foundation is already splitting. Money creation does not spread evenly across the economy. It flows into the financial system first, boosting asset markets long before it reaches the real economy. The result is a distorted landscape where stocks, real estate, and commodities inflate in price while ordinary citizens struggle to keep up, unaware they are financing the boom through the erosion of their own savings. And every time inflation begins to bite, leaders reassure the public that it is temporary, manageable, or necessary. They blame external factors, global instability, unexpected shocks, anything except the deliberate policy choices that created the problem. But history shows the intent clearly. When a government can expand its money supply at will, it gains a powerful tool: the ability to reduce the real value of its own debts. By letting inflation run just high enough, those debts become easier to service, while citizens absorb the cost through higher prices and declining living standards. This is why every major financial collapse begins with the same script. The authorities loosen monetary conditions, claiming it will create prosperity. The new money floods into markets, inflating valuations far beyond their fundamentals. And while the public celebrates rising asset prices, the seeds of the next disaster are already planted. Inflation is not just the first stage of the cycle. It is the ignition point, the moment when every distortion, every bubble, every future crash becomes mathematically inevitable. And as this pressure builds beneath the surface, the system moves into the next stage, one that transforms this invisible inflation into something far more seductive and far more dangerous. As inflation quietly corrodes the value of money, the system transitions into a more visible and far more intoxicating phase, the deliberate construction of financial bubbles. This is where the newly created money, instead of strengthening the real economy, is funneled into speculative assets, creating an illusion of prosperity that feels irresistible to anyone watching prices surge. And the key word here is illusion, because nothing about this stage is organic or sustainable. It is the engineered expansion of credit layered on top of the inflation that already distorted the foundation, multiplying every imbalance beneath a shiny surface of rising valuations. What makes bubbles so effective is that they work on both math and psychology. When money becomes cheap and abundant, borrowing increases. Investors chase the rising prices. Institutions amplify the momentum. And ordinary citizens, seeing others get rich, feel pressured to join the frenzy before they are left behind. The system exploits this human instinct. It rewards those who rush in early, creating stories of instant wealth that spread through society like fuel. Meanwhile, those who hesitate are told they lack vision, that this time is different, that new technologies or new economic paradigms justify valuations detached from reality. But behind the scenes, the forces driving the bubble are always the same: excess liquidity, excessive leverage, and a coordinated narrative designed to keep confidence artificially high. Central banks maintain low interest rates to prolong the boom. Politicians celebrate rising markets as proof of strong leadership. Financial institutions package risk into complex products that hide fragility behind layers of sophisticated language. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Higher prices attract more investors, which pushes prices higher still. And as long as the upward momentum continues, almost no one wants to question the structure holding it together. Yet every bubble contains the seeds of its own destruction. As prices rise further from underlying economic reality, the system becomes increasingly brittle. Leverage magnifies losses as easily as it magnifies gains. Even the smallest shock can trigger forced selling, liquidity, shortages, and cascading failures. But during the bubble's peak, warning signs are dismissed, critics are mocked, and those who point to historical patterns are told they are stuck in the past. This denial is not accidental. It is a necessary component of the bubble's survival. For the cycle to advance, the public must believe the prosperity is real, even as the mathematical instability behind it grows impossible to ignore. By the time the bubble reaches its final phase, speculation has replaced investment, narratives have replaced fundamentals, and confidence has replaced logic. The system becomes a tower built on leverage, inflated by emotion, and held together only by the hope that prices will continue rising forever. And when that hope finally cracks, when the first tremors ripple through the financial structure, the cycle shifts abruptly, violently, into the next stage, where the illusion of endless growth gives way to the unforgiving me. When a bubble finally reaches its breaking point, the collapse that follows is often described as sudden, unexpected, or triggered by a random event. But history shows that crashes are not unpredictable explosions. They are mathematical certainties. Every bubble stretches the system further away from equilibrium, and every stretch increases the force of the snap. By the time the crash arrives, the real surprise is not that the system failed, but that it managed to stay afloat for as long as it did. Crashes are simply the moment when reality reclaims dominance over illusion. The unraveling begins quietly. Liquidity tightens. Borrowers struggle to roll over debt. A single default or missed payment sends tremors through highly leveraged institutions. What looked like isolated failures quickly reveal themselves as structural weakness. Confidence evaporates faster than any policy can restore it, because the market suddenly recognizes what it had been ignoring for years. Valuations were inflated, credit was overextended, and risk was far greater than anyone admitted publicly. The same institutions that encouraged risk-taking now rushed to protect themselves, selling assets, cutting exposure, and triggering the very panic they hope to avoid. As prices fall, leverage becomes a weapon pointed back at the system. Margin calls accelerate the selling. Banks restrict lending to preserve liquidity. Investors, once euphoric, become desperate to exit. The cycle of forced liquidation feeds on itself, turning what began as a correction into a full-scale collapse. And while the public is told that the crisis came out of nowhere, those close to the center understand the truth. The crash is the system correcting the distortions created in the earlier stages, a violent snap back to fundamentals after years of artificial expansion. But here is the darker reality. Crashes are not only predictable, they are profitable for those positioned correctly. The same groups that benefited during the inflation and bubble phases often have the information, tools, and influence to protect themselves or even profit from the downturn. They shift assets before the fall, short markets they know are unstable, or hedge against the very risks they encouraged others to ignore. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens, pension holders, small investors, and businesses bear the brunt of the collapse, losing what took years or decades to build. And yet, even as the system crumbles, the cycle is not finished. The crash merely clears the stage for the next maneuver, one that appears as a rescue, but often deepens the very problems that caused the collapse in the first place. Before we move forward, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt that market crashes seem a little too convenient for those already in power, and far too destructive for everyone else? As the crash wipes out confidence and exposes the fragility hidden beneath years of artificial growth, the system enters a stage that feels chaotic on the surface but is remarkably consistent in its structure. Governments, central banks, and global financial institutions rush forward with urgent announcements, emergency meetings, and sweeping interventions. These measures are presented as heroic efforts to stabilize the economy, but in reality, they often serve to expand the very distortions that cause the collapse. What the public sees as rescue is often a controlled demolition, followed by strategic reconstruction that consolidates power in fewer hands. In this phase, policies that would have been unthinkable during normal times suddenly become acceptable. Massive liquidity injections, rapid interest rate cuts, asset purchase programs, corporate bailouts, and unprecedented fiscal spending are framed as the only way to prevent further disaster. The narrative is always the same. Without intervention, the system would fall apart. But behind the scenes, the new money flows first to institutions deemed too big to fail, reinforcing their dominance and shielding them from the consequences of the risks they took. Losses are socialized, recovery is privatized, and the cycle continues. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens experience a very different reality. Jobs disappear. Credit becomes harder to access. Small businesses collapse under the weight of rising costs and falling demand. Housing becomes unstable, as liquidity evaporates at the bottom of the market while surging at the top. Families who survived the initial crash now face a prolonged period of uncertainty, forced to navigate an economy reshaped to prioritize the stabilization of the financial sector over the survival of the real economy. The public is told that these sacrifices are necessary, that short-term pain will lead to long-term stability, even though the previous stages have already shown where this path leads. What makes this era especially dangerous is the psychological shift it creates. People who once trusted institutions begin to question everything. Inflation may surge again as governments flood markets with liquidity, or deflation may take hold if credit freezes. But in either case, the underlying issue remains untouched. The system is increasingly dependent on artificial support. Markets stop responding to fundamentals and instead become tethered to policy announcements, turning economics into theater and reducing real productivity to a secondary concern. This is where the cycle tightens around the system like a vice. Every intervention adds more debt, more leverage, more complexity, and more dependency on future interventions. Instead of repairing the damage, the actions taken in this stage build the foundation for the next crisis, ensuring that each cycle becomes more volatile, more destructive, and harder to escape. And as this fragile stability takes shape, a new and more subtle form of manipulation begins to emerge, one designed not just to influence markets, but to steer the entire structure of money itself. As the chaos phase stabilizes just enough to prevent total collapse, the system shifts into a quieter but far more consequential stage, one defined not by dramatic headlines or visible market turmoil, but by subtle technical adjustments to the architecture of money itself. This is where the true power of the cycle reveals itself. While the public focuses on unemployment numbers, stimulus checks, or political debates, central banks and financial institutions recalibrate the monetary framework in ways that transform the economy at its core. These changes often appear technical, abstract, or too complex to follow, but their impact is profound and permanent. In this stage, the authorities normalize extraordinary policies. Interest rates remain near zero, not temporarily, but as a structural necessity. Balance sheets expand indefinitely as asset purchases become a continuous part of monetary operations rather than emergency tools. Debt ceilings rise. Liquidity facilities evolve into permanent channels for injecting money directly into the financial system. Each of these actions is presented as a response to temporary instability, yet none of them ever fully disappears. They become the new baseline, an unspoken acknowledgement that the system cannot survive without constant intervention. And while these measures are described as stabilizing forces, they fundamentally reshape incentives. Cheap money encourages corporations to borrow endlessly, not to invest in long-term growth, but to buy back shares, inflate earnings per share, and enrich executives. Financial institutions, now accustomed to an environment of virtually unlimited liquidity, expand speculative strategies, confident that central banks will intervene if volatility rises. Meanwhile, savers and workers suffer in silence. Their wages stagnate, their savings lose purchasing power, and their cost of living rises as asset prices surge far beyond what incomes can support. What makes this stage especially deceptive is its tone of reassurance. Leaders speak calmly, markets rally, headlines shift from panic to optimism. But beneath the surface, the foundation of the monetary system is rewired in ways that increase dependence on central authority. The more the system relies on artificial liquidity to function, the less it can operate according to real economic fundamentals. It becomes a managed machine rather than a market-driven system, a structure so delicately balanced that even minor shocks require intervention to prevent collapse. This manipulation is not merely economic, it is strategic. By controlling the supply of money, the cost of borrowing, and the direction of liquidity, central banks shape winners and losers long before market forces have a chance to act. The cycle tightens its grip as wealth concentrates further, inequality widens, and market outcomes reflect policy design more than productivity. What emerges is not a free economy, but a controlled ecosystem, one where the invisible hand has been replaced by an invisible lever, pulled constantly to maintain an image of stability. But as this silent manipulation deepens, the next phase begins to form. A phase that appears to offer recovery, progress, and renewal, yet often hides another layer of strategic deception beneath its polished surface. As the monetary manipulation phase takes hold, something interesting begins to happen. Markets start rising again. Headlines shift from crisis to optimism. Analysts talk about green shoots, renewed confidence, and the start of a new expansion. Politicians take credit for stabilization. Central banks congratulate themselves for decisive action. And the public, exhausted from months or years of uncertainty, wants desperately to believe that the worst is over. This longing for normalcy becomes the emotional fuel that powers the next stage, the manufactured recovery. On the surface, everything appears to be improving. Stock markets rebound even while unemployment remains high. Housing prices surge despite declining real incomes. Corporate profits climb even though productivity stagnates. It feels like a recovery, but the underlying engine isn't real economic strength. It's the artificial liquidity injected during the chaos phase. The growth is built on the same inflated asset valuations, the same cheap credit, the same unsustainable leverage that caused the previous bubble to burst. This is why recoveries in the modern cycle no longer resemble historical rebounds driven by innovation, expansion, or rising productivity. Instead, they follow a familiar script. Asset markets lead the way upward long before the real economy stabilizes. Institutions closest to the liquidity spigot recover first. Large corporations regain their footing through debt-financed restructuring, mergers, and buybacks. Meanwhile, small businesses, workers, and savers struggle to rebuild from losses that never fully heal. The economy becomes a split reality. One world surges upward, another tries to survive beneath it. What makes this phase so deceptive is that the recovery is intentionally framed as evidence that the system works, that intervention saved the economy, that confidence is returning. But in truth, the recovery is simply another layer of the cycle, a way to rebuild the structure just enough for the next iteration of expansion and collapse. Debt grows instead of shrinking. Risks migrate instead of disappearing. Fragility increases even as optimism spreads. And because this stage masks instability with rising prices, most people fail to see how much more vulnerable the system has become. This illusion is essential to the progression toward Stage 5 and Stage 6. Without the appearance of recovery, the public might demand structural reform. But with markets rising, with headlines celebrating growth, with politicians pointing to charts and data, the deeper flaws remain hidden. The cycle continues uninterrupted. And, by the time people realize the recovery was built on sand, the next downturn has already been engineered into existence. Before we move on, share your perspective in the comments. Do you feel that modern recoveries seem disconnected from reality, almost like they are built to reassure rather than to rebuild? I want to hear how you see this stage playing out where you live. By the time the manufactured recovery settles into place, the system enters the most dangerous and revealing phase of the entire cycle. The moment when the underlying contradictions, distortions, and accumulated imbalances become too large to conceal. This is Stage 5, the point where the public narrative of stability no longer matches the lived reality of millions of people. Markets may still be rising, but trust is falling. Official data may show improvement, but daily life tells a different story. The illusion begins to tear at the seams, and once it does, every attempt to hold it together only exposes more of what has been hidden. What defines Stage 5 is not a single event, but a widening gap between perception and truth. Inflation becomes persistent rather than temporary, yet officials insist it is under control. Asset prices remain high, but fewer people can afford homes or invest in markets. Corporations report record profits even as real wages stagnate. Governments announce strong growth while debts reach unprecedented levels. The system becomes a mosaic of contradictions, numbers pointing up, while living standards drift down. And people begin to notice. This stage is fueled by one powerful dynamic: declining trust. When citizens see prices rising faster than paychecks, when they watch markets soar while their own economic position weakens, when they hear optimistic speeches that conflict with their own experience, something fundamental shifts. The social contract that once held the system together starts to fracture. Confidence, the invisible currency that keeps financial structures functioning, begins to evaporate. And once confidence weakens, the system requires even more intervention to maintain the appearance of stability. Governments and central banks respond to this pressure the only way they know how: by amplifying the actions of previous stages. More liquidity injections, more stimulus, more debt, more regulations that favor large institutions, more messaging campaigns aimed at calming public concern. But each layer of intervention becomes less effective than the last. People start asking questions that were previously unthinkable. Why is everything getting more expensive? Why do crises repeat? Why do the same institutions always benefit, no matter what happens? As these questions spread, they weaken the foundations that the entire cycle depends upon. Stage 5 is the tipping point because it reveals the truth that the earlier stages worked so hard to disguise. The system is not self-sustaining. It is propped up by constant manipulation, perpetual debt expansion, and the belief that authorities can always contain the next shock. When that belief fades, the system begins to wobble under its own weight. The manufactured recovery loses credibility. Monetary manipulation loses effectiveness. Political narratives lose influence. And the path toward the final stage of the cycle becomes difficult to avoid. In this fragile atmosphere, even small disruptions can escalate into systemic threats. What once would have been a minor correction now risks igniting a deeper panic. What would have been a temporary shock now exposes the fragility of the entire structure. Stage 5 is not collapse, but the unmistakable warning that collapse is no longer a distant possibility. It is the next logical step unless something fundamental changes. As Stage 5 deepens, the effects are no longer confined to domestic economies. They ripple outward, reshaping the global financial and political landscape. When a major economy enters the late stages of this cycle, trade balances become volatile. Foreign investments fluctuate unpredictably, and international confidence in currency and credit begins to fracture. Nations that once relied on the predictability of global markets suddenly face instability in exchange rates, capital flows, and access to credit. Even countries with strong fundamentals find themselves impacted, because global finance is a tightly interconnected web where vulnerabilities in one node create stress throughout the network. The interplay of debt, currency manipulation, and economic stimulus across borders magnifies the cycle's intensity. Countries holding reserves in the currency of the affected nation may see those reserves lose value as inflation erodes purchasing power. Exporters reliant on stable demand encounter sudden shifts as consumers in the troubled economy adjust spending. Meanwhile, capital often flees perceived risk zones, flooding into other regions and creating asset bubbles elsewhere. The cycle thus becomes contagious, a series of interconnected crises linked through debt obligations, trade relationships, and financial instruments designed to appear safe but built on fragile assumptions. Geopolitical consequences are equally profound. Nations experiencing financial strain may be forced to renegotiate trade deals, adjust defense commitments, or alter foreign policy objectives to secure immediate economic relief. Alliances can fracture under pressure as countries prioritize domestic survival over international obligations. At the same time, opportunistic actors exploit vulnerabilities, leveraging economic turmoil to expand influence, negotiate advantageous terms, or destabilize rivals. Historical patterns show that these periods of economic vulnerability often coincide with heightened tensions, as struggling nations seek to compensate for domestic instability through assertive foreign policy or strategic maneuvers abroad. Even financial institutions operating globally feel the impact. Banks, hedge funds, and sovereign wealth managers adjust portfolios to mitigate risk, sometimes triggering cascading effects that amplify volatility. The interconnectedness of debt markets, derivatives, and credit lines ensures that shocks are rarely isolated. Localized problems become regional or global challenges, and what begins as Stage 5 in one economy quickly resonates across continents. Observers who fail to recognize the systemic nature of these events may be blindsided, assuming that crises are confined to a single nation, rather than seeing the structural mechanisms linking global instability. Stage 5 is therefore more than a domestic phenomenon. It is the moment when local financial distortions escalate into worldwide ramifications. Every policy decision, every intervention, every attempt at stabilization carries consequences far beyond borders. And while governments and central banks scramble to maintain order, the international system begins to realign, setting the stage for the ultimate transition to the next, most critical phase of the grand fraud cycle. Stage 6 is the moment every cycle has been building toward, the point when the system's structural weaknesses can no longer be masked, when debt, leverage, and manipulation collide with human psychology, and when confidence finally erodes entirely. Unlike earlier stages, this is not about bubbles, temporary crashes, or artificial recoveries. It is the phase where accumulated distortions manifest in full clarity. Markets become volatile beyond comprehension. Currencies fluctuate wildly, and institutions that once seemed invincible are suddenly exposed as fragile, overextended, or completely dependent on external support. The warning signs we've seen in inflation, bubbles, crashes, chaos, manipulation, and manufactured recovery all converge, and the system is forced to confront the unsustainable reality it has been building for decades. What makes Stage 6 so dangerous is the speed and intensity with which it unfolds. By this point, interventions become less effective, confidence collapses rapidly, and policy tools that worked in earlier stages fail to stabilize markets. The effects are systemic, touching not only the economy but also society, politics, and global relations. Nations scramble to maintain control. Governments attempt emergency measures, and the public begins to realize that the perceived stability of past decades was an illusion. Decisions made in previous stages, massive debt accumulation, artificially suppressed interest rates, market bailouts, become liabilities that accelerate the collapse rather than mitigate it. History shows that once Stage 6 begins, the transition to full systemic reordering can be swift and unforgiving. Yet even in this critical moment, there is opportunity for awareness, preparation, and informed action. Understanding the mechanisms that have led to this point empowers individuals to navigate the turbulence, anticipate shifts in markets, and recognize patterns that few others see. Knowledge becomes a strategic asset in a world where uncertainty dominates, and where those who understand the cycle have the advantage over those trapped in the conventional narrative. If you've followed this journey through all 6 stages, now is the time to reflect, comment, and engage. Let me know in the comments if this analysis resonates with what you've observed or experienced. Comments like, "I see this everywhere," or "This explains so much," help us understand different perspectives. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you can continue uncovering the hidden mechanisms behind financial systems, and don't miss what comes next. There's a video here that complements this discussion perfectly, diving even deeper into the strategies, outcomes, and global implications. Click over and continue exploring with me. You'll want to see how these patterns evolve and what they mean for the future.